found was that on certain hardware platforms, and I'm not going to say I tested this on 50 platforms, I did this on 2 or 3, so from client to client, I'll make sure if I recommend something, there's a reason to recommend it. Sync was occasionally slightly faster, and slightly faster in my mind is enough reason to go with something when we're talking about physical I/O, because we always treat that as a bottleneck. However, I've also seen benchmarks where direct I/O is as much as 4 times faster than the desync. So, in the environments that support the direct I/O, you do want to benchmark this and make sure it's faster. I've seen it 20 to 50% faster. I haven't personally seen it 4 times faster, but to evaluate it. Note that you do need to pick one of these. You do need to make sure you're writing directly to the disk. Why is this relevant? This is relevant because not everybody uses raw partitions anymore. In the olden days, raw partitions were critical in Unix environments, but today most folks are on SAN, and we do need to avoid that OS level buffering. We do need to do, to get the desync and the direct I/O and make sure that we've got the options set properly. Make sure those things are turned on. Note that desync and direct I/O are mutually exclusive. You'll have one on or the other on. Here's a quick recommendation. You don't want either one of these things on for TempDB. Why? Go ahead and let the operating system for TempDB. Here's a quick one for you. Do most folks use high availability hardware for their TempDB? Like a RAID 5 or RAID 10 or mirroring or anything like that? No hit going up either way. When I first got into database administration, we're going back in the late 80s, early 90s in this technology, I used to say, it just doesn't matter because TempDB doesn't have any information that you care about. Why bother mirroring? Why bother whatever? I mean, we care about performance. We really don't care about stability as long as the data is still there. And then somebody said to me, but Jeff, what if one of the TempDB devices goes down? I said, oops, that's a really good point. So high availability for the TempDB devices, but from a reliability standpoint, this goes down, system comes up, it gets refreshed anyway. Performance, well, we're talking about performance here. We want to go ahead and let the operating system cache TempDB because we don't care if that gets written. So desync off, direct I/O on. With other situations, data files, index files, system files, you name it, just to see which one works. You can't use them both at the same time. Next thing I see missing, parallel processing. And I first had parallel processing available to me. I was running a group of DBAs, and this was when 11.0 was going up to 11.5. Well, from 11.0 to 11.5, I was looking at all the cool new things, and I wanted to plug parallel processing because I thought it was the greatest thing since sliced bread. Well, we did the upgrade. We're also upgrading hardware. So we're basically going to hardware, which was about twice as fast, and we're going to 11.5, which is supposed to do really cool stuff. I said, great, let's throw parallelism at this because, gee, we're only running at about 33% of capacity right now. If we're going up to hardware, which is twice as fast, I've got lots of extra room to go for the parallelism. Listen to me. Spiked everything up, CPUs all spiked at 100%. Were my user community happy? That didn't work out. Lesson learned. When you enable the parallelism, what you're doing is enabling the server to make the decision, I'm going to use 3 times the resources to do the work in order to get things back at 80% of the time. This is not the most efficient way to run your processors. However, most folks have a lot of extra processor power. Terry was talking about using 5% of your box or 20% of your box. This is relatively typical these days. Most of the shops that I run into are running at 15 to 20% of capacity, spiking up to 50% of capacity. This is after I'm done tuning. You're shaking your head. When you're running at low capacity standpoint, you're running at you can go ahead and implement the parallelism, but don't throw 500 worker processes and a degree of parallelism of 10 at this thing. Start it slow. If you have 10 processors, start with a degree of parallelism of 4, 5, 6. Throw 20, 40, 60 worker processes at it, and watch to see what happens with your CPUs. If your CPUs are spiking at 90%, you should probably be talking to Terry about some more hardware for your box, by the way. So, limited parallel processing. My recommendations, by the way, I like to see at peak, I like to see about 70 to 80% of CPU, and I like to see your average is running lower than that. 70 to 80% means you're probably scaled pretty well. It means that you are probably have room for excess capacity if your peaks have significant spikes in them. If you're running at 70 to 80% on a continual basis and spiking higher, again, probably time to talk to Terry about his Power 7 series or adding a couple processors to it. So the parallel processing, don't go overboard. Note that you will use more CPU. This is not a CPU reduction thing. This is a user experience thing. We're speeding things up for the users. Turning these things on can get users calling you saying, this happened 4 times faster than usual. What did you do? You say, I sprinkled fairy dust on the box. Turning the parallel processing on, Sage. I think we covered the points here. Note that we want to do this in isolation. When I say enable parallel processing and isolation down here, I'm saying you don't want to do this when you're making 15 other changes to your system. As DBAs, we tend to be professional paranoids, and as a result, when we make changes to the system, we want to do things one at a time and observe the results. Reality, though, usually sets in, and the users say, well, you can make changes a week from next Friday and then not again until the 3rd quarter. So frequently make multiple changes all at once, things that we're confident about, but if something happens, I really want to know what caused something to happen. When we DAs get telephone calls and somebody says the performance is getting crappy, what do we always ask? Change. We want to be implementers of positive change. We don't want to be implementers of questionable change. Parallel processing is a good thing to do in isolation. Make sure that when you do implement parallel processing, you want to change your max parallel degree, also your max hash parallel degree. You want to ensure that even if you're not partitioned, you take advantage of those hashes. Don't put out too many worker processes until you have looked at the load that you're creating, the additional CPU load that you're creating on your machine. You will create additional CPU load. It doesn't make intrinsic sense because you figure, okay, 4 processes all have X amount of workload, we have to do 4X work. You think that if we're doing it faster, we'd get a spike. But it seems not to work that way. It does spike. There is extra overhead with running in parallel. This is a case of I can observe more easily and adjust and work with this more easily than explain. So worker processes, parallel degree, scan parallel degree, handles the hash. Make sure you get extra CPU set aside. Full preventive maintenance regimen. One of the things I will always ask when I walk into a shop is, what does your preventive maintenance look like? Why? Because some folks say, we don't have a window for it. Some folks say, we can't run it very often. Some folks say, we update our stats, every quarter or so when we get a weekend to run them. This is a great way of creating erratic performance issues. So here are my basic recommendations for preventive maintenance for performance. First, keep your stats up to date. How often? As often as you can afford to do it. That when you have stats running, today's stats is relatively non-intrusive. If you have to run this during user hours, run it during user hours, but do run it. Intrusive is it? If you are running stats against the all pages locking, the old locking scheme, you'll get shared page locks. If you have a data-only locking scheme, you will not get shared page locks. You will get, it's level 0 of locking. You won't get locking at all. So the blocking and locking that used to be an issue back in the olden days with update stats is effectively gone. You can run this when you need to. Very important. And again, do an update index stats as opposed to just an update stats. The reorgs. When you're using the data pages locking or the data rows locking approaches, this takes a lot of shortcuts that have to do with deletions, avoidance of page splits, row forwarding, a lot of things that it does internally. I actually spent a while on this in a performance and tuning class. Because it's doing this, inefficiencies start popping up at query time. So if I'm looking for rows and I'm here on this page and I have to bounce to 3 other pages to pick up the rows that ought to be on this page, that's performance hit. It's amazing how many times simply doing a reorg will bring performance up significantly enough that the users will call and say, good job, I don't know what you did, but do it again. It's rebuilds. With the advent